Welcome to the CannMed Coffee Talk podcast, where we talk with the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing, many of whom will be part of the CannMed 2021 conference in Pasadena, California, April 12th through 14th. I am your host, Ben Amaralt, and yes, you heard that correctly. If you didn't listen to our last episode, or you haven't signed up for email alerts, or you don't follow us on social media, then you may not have heard that CannMed 2020 has been postponed to April 2021. Our team made the difficult decision to push the event back, given the fact that California, like most of the U.S., is still battling the COVID-19 pandemic. After speaking with the Pasadena Convention Center, local government officials, as well as the CannMed team, we felt that moving the event to April 2021 would be the best way for us to provide a safe environment for everyone. If you already purchased your ticket to the 2020 event and you have a conflict with the new dates, you are entitled to a 100% refund. Go to canmedevents.com/COVID-19 for more information. The good news is the CannMed Coffee Talk podcast will continue with new episodes every other Wednesday. We look forward to continuing the CannMed conversation through this medium, as well as on our social media accounts and on our website. We will be announcing our safety keynote presenter, as well as new speakers and panel discussions throughout this year and into 2021. So please sign up for email alerts if you haven't already, and please do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Just search for CannMed Events. On this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Cindy Orser, Chief Scientific Officer at Clip Labs. Dr. Orser has more than 25 years of experience innovating technologies related to cannabis, human diagnostics, and even detecting biothreat agents. We spent most of the conversation talking about the panel Cindy will moderate at CannMed 2021 titled The Hidden Costs of Cannabis, Environmental Impact. In that panel, she and her fellow panelists will explore how current cannabis cultivation practices contribute to air pollution, water pollution, and increased energy consumption, and also how the federal ban on cannabis is actually worsening those problems. We also talked about terpenes because Dr. Orser co-authored a really interesting article titled Making Sense of Cannabis Strains Through Chemometrics in Review. Cindy is a big proponent of terpene testing and the way that it can help consumers better understand the differences between cannabis cultivars. She also cautions that without terpene testing, consumers are blind to vape products that may add large, unnatural amounts of terpenes to the products. To date, there hasn't been any research into what, if any, health risks come with inhaling those compounds in such large concentrations. Before I get to my conversation with Cindy, I would like to thank our episode sponsor, Terpenes and Testing Magazine. Terpenes and Testing Magazine is the scientific backdrop against which in-depth understanding of cannabis news, compliance and regulation, chemistry, analytical testing, and horticulture science can fully unfold and crystallize. Go to terpenesandtesting.com to read their free blog content and subscribe to their bi-monthly publication. And finally, this episode of CannMed Coffee Talk is fueled by the Hemp and Coffee Exchange. Hemp coffee is a healthy, delicious, natural product rich in trace minerals and nutrients, providing sustained energy without the crash of regular coffee. For more information, check out hempcoffeeexchange.com and use the promo code DRINKHEMP to get 10% off your purchase. Okay, without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Cindy Orser from Clip Labs. Good afternoon, Cindy. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, hi, Ben. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you again for being part of CannMed 2020 and serving on our advisory board. I know that's a tremendous help to our team when it comes to evaluating the abstract submissions and potential speakers. So on behalf of everyone in the CannMed team, I want to thank you for that, first and foremost.
Yeah, of course.
And
My pleasure.
I'm really excited to talk with you today because I know that you're leading a very interesting panel at this year's event that's all about the environmental impacts of cannabis cultivation. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit about what we can expect from that discussion.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm happy to do that. When the CannMed organizers asked me for some ideas for panels, what I thought would be interesting. I mean, this is something that's been on my mind for a while, because I think there just has not been much of any attention placed on, what is the true cost of growing cannabis. In this case, we're taking it from an environmental perspective. But I think because cannabis has been under federal prohibition for all this while, it's really hindered any research into what the impact of what is now a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States on what is still a Schedule I drug at the federal level. So there's been very limited studies that have documented the environmental impact from cultivation of cannabis and production. And there are some emerging human environmental impacts that we need to address. We need to categorize them, and we have to use them to inform policies going forward. Of course, if we had federal legalization, I think it would solve almost all of these problems. And we would be able to come up with a cohesive way of addressing it. There would be federal grant money made available to study these impacts. And it's just way overdue, whether we're looking at air pollution, land use to inform land use policies, energy consumption, and water usage and water pollution. Those are just, the big ones. There are other ones that we also don't talk about, which is just all the waste, the packaging waste, the spent cannabis waste that's going unused, the exposure of cannabis workers in the workplace, and of course, the unknown long-term health impacts from chronic administration of high-potency cannabis. I mean, there's a myriad of topics, but we decided to focus it on the environmental impact. So I think it'll be very timely to address some of these issues and get some input from some of the people who are studying this now.
Right. And it sounds like a lot of this research is sort of in its early stages. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it definitely is. It's really been emanating from a handful of academicians who've taken it up because of their interests, and state-based inquiries. Like several states are now looking at sustainability, and they've formed working groups on sustainability. So there has been some effort put out there to look at these enormous energy and water costs that go into the indoor grow environment. And of course, it takes us right back to that federal prohibition and the states spending for themselves and coming up with these incredibly complex regulatory requirements for growing cannabis that has forced the industry indoors. And so there's these intensive energy operations that are kind of out of sight, right? So it's, again, one of those things that if you don't see it, if you're not involved in the industry and you're not aware of it, you might smell the effluent when you drive by some of these big grows, and then you immediately know, oh yeah, there's some big grows here. But you don't even think about that those volatile organic compounds are actually interacting with emissions from automobiles and forming destructive compounds contributing to to ozone. So it's good to start to get a handle on what are the levels of these VOCs. There was a study done in Colorado that showed that cannabis indoor grows have probably doubled the volatile organic emissions there. And, cities along the Front Range of Colorado already are dealing with air pollution issues. So that's just one example. Of course, you move into California, the larger issue is water and water theft and disastrous downstream water consequences, killing aquatic life and stealing water that would normally be going to either communities or to other agricultural operations. And then, of course, energy's a big one. I've heard some crazy figures, and I don't even know how accurate it is, but that energy consumption from indoor grows is equivalent to about 4% of all the energy that's consumed in the U.S. So it's very significant. You go into the northwest part of the country where energy is produced from hydroelectric power. So there you have the intersection of both energy production and water use. And, how should water be used and energy consumption be used, and how do we regulate it? And it's just all so chaotic, and it would be ever so nice if we could have a cohesive national policy on these issues.
Yeah, that issue and many others in this space, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
right.
I'm curious, so how many or how much of this sort of environmental impact is due to the fact that a lot of these grows are indoors?
Yeah, well, I think that is largely the source of the problem, right? I mean, what I keep trying to think of any other agricultural cash crop that's this large, right? The cannabis industry is multi-billion-dollar that is being grown indoor under intensive energy requirements. I just don't think there's any kind of comparison. And of course, the reason it's indoors is because states and localities, when the industry was standing up, nobody wanted to see it. You couldn't grow it outdoors. It's not allowed to be grown outdoors, and you have to have these elaborate security systems, and it should be grown outdoors. I mean, it's nuts. And combined with the fact that we have these artificial geographic boundaries that, you can't move cannabis across the state line. So that requires every cannabis complicit state to have this very intensive agriculture going on. For example, I mean, Las Vegas, why is Las Vegas growing marijuana indoors? I mean, it's so hot there. And, Lake Mead is at its lowest level of all times. And there's no other crop that it has to be grown locally because of lack of federal regulation.
Right.
Right. We don't, like in Vegas, they don't grow their own strawberries and grapes and pears and almonds, but they have to grow their own cannabis. So it just doesn't even make sense. And I think part of it is because we don't see it. Most people don't see it because it's in these large warehouses. So you don't realize how absurd it all is, and the fact that these plants should be growing outdoors. Like we see hemp growing finally now. Of course, Northern California is unique because I think there's something like 14,000 trespass grows on federal, state, and private land up there.
Wow.
And California has this riparian law that if your agricultural plot comes in contact with a waterway, that you have a right to use some of that water. So that's a very unique situation to California that has led to this massive depletion and erosion of waterways in Northern California. And then because a lot of them are black market grows, they use massive amounts of pesticides and rodenticides because they want to kill the small rodents. And then all of those chemicals leach into the streams and kill the fish and end up, downstream in somebody's drinking water source. So if there's a domino effect here, it's just time to address it, I think.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you talk about the difference between cannabis and hemp regulations, where hemp is pretty much allowed to be grown outdoors. I recently spoke with Seth Crawford, who's going to be our cultivation keynote at CannMed. And he said one of the main reasons that he and his brother founded Oregon CBD and kind of went into hemp is because of the regulations were more sort of relaxed, and they could grow at a much larger scale outdoors and sort of do the breeding activities that they were really interested in doing. And that
yes.
He also highlighted that it's sort of madness that so much of the cannabis is grown indoors and locally, as you pointed out.
Yeah, it is madness. Yeah,
so
it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And so one of my questions I was going to ask was, how is the impacts of cannabis cultivation on the environment sort of different or similar than other crops? And I think you already answered that, is that, no other major crop is really grown indoors, correct?
No, I mean, I am hard pressed to come up with anything. I mean, in the U.S., we used to grow, some ornamental plants and flowers in greenhouses. I mean, growing in greenhouses would be a step forward from
right.
how it's grown now with all the HVAC requirements in these hot climates. And, the water consumption, that was the other analogy. I remember there's some commercial for California almonds, and one almond takes 26 gallons of water. Well, I was figuring out how much water one cannabis plant would take, and it uses about 6 gallons a day. So even if it's a short season of 100 days, that's 600 gallons of water.
Wow.
For one cannabis plant that would make, 2 to 5 pounds of flour, I suppose. So water's a big deal, and I think water is going to be a prime topic of discussion going forward. There's more and more of the arable land around the world is going to become, uncultivatable because of the lack of water. So I think we need to be smarter, and we certainly could be smarter if we had some cooperation at the federal level.
And that's interesting too, because I imagine that water consumption must be different in an indoor versus outdoor environment, just because indoor you might be growing hydroponically or in cocoa or some other medium instead of planting directly into the soil. Is that true? Is that fair to say?
That's true. That is, and there are some innovation trends out there. So for those cultivators who are just starting out and can build their facility in a smart way, there's this cogen technology that's been around for a while that combines heat with power. It was used originally to grow tomatoes next to power plants, so you don't lose electricity over transmission lines. It's all right there together. And so I've seen some interesting cultivation facilities that have been set up from the beginning that way. You can also take a closed loop approach where you are recovering the water and you have elaborate water reprocessing. So you're collecting all of that water or the humidity that's being transpired off the plants, and you kind of have a closed loop. But if you're already in a large indoor grow, being able to retrofit that into a more innovative design is prohibitively expensive. And not to totally knock the cultivation industry, because they have come up with innovation. Of course, the biggest one was switching over to LED lights from fluorescent lights. They cost more again to install, but they last 10 times as long. They don't emit heat. You can spectrally tune them. They last 10 times longer. Most large grows now have computer controlled cooling, so it's not just like an on-off switch. It's only used when it's required. And then you can take the entire green approach if you're growing outdoors with a closed loop, where you chop the remaining plant biomass and you put it back into the soil, or you use it to compost, and you can have a much healthier approach to agriculture. But again, that takes a lot more time and input, so your profits go down. And in these states where there hasn't been any limit on the number of licenses that have been issued for cultivation, I mean, the competition is fierce. And then on top of that, you have these horrendous reoccurring annual fees and the taxes. And, it's hard to compete with the black market, especially in California, Oregon, Hawaii, even in California. I mean, the black market is still large. So I see that as wrapped up into this entire problem of what is the real cost of growing cannabis. It's also, you have to take that into account.
Yeah, and as you pointed out earlier, the black market is certainly not immune to some of these environmental impacts. Even though they may be growing outdoors, no. they have a whole nother set of issues.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
yes.
So you sort of touched on this a little bit, but I don't know. Forgive me if I'm putting you on the spot, but if you were to start a new cultivation operation, what would sort of be the ideal setup in terms of limiting the environmental impact?
Well, if you could grow in a greenhouse, if whatever state you were in, if it was allowed to grow in greenhouses, I mean, that would be the way to go. So at least you're taking advantage of sunlight. So you don't have to have grow lights or minimal grow lights. You can take advantage of the natural ventilation system that greenhouses offer. And if you could have some type of water stream recovery, so you're recycling your water. I've always thought, there's these grows dump so many nutrients into their growing operations, and usually it just goes into the sewage. I mean, there's like no reclamation, and most sewage treatment plants, water treatment plants don't have a way to reclaim those nutrients. So that leads to the common problem of algal blooms downstream of agricultural runoff. I mean, this is a sin that's not limited to the cannabis industry. I mean, it's been a problem with agriculture for a long time, is capturing runoff and these high levels of nutrients that the plants just aren't able to consume because of over application. So that's something else that growers are getting smarter about, is actually monitoring the amount of nutrients that plants are using so that you're not over fertilizing.
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the other things you touched on too is that part of the problem is that, cannabis cultivation has become hyper localized just because of the federal prohibition. And I have to imagine that once that goes away, then, some enterprising cultivator is going to find the perfect environment to grow cannabis in this country and then just kind of dominate the scene. And
Yes, yeah. So then we'll have big ag moving in. We'll still
right.
have some of the boutique. We'll have some boutique greenhouse farmers probably that curate specific strains that their clients want or have unique attributes. Of course, we'll also continue to have breeding efforts that will maximize some of the lesser well-known secondary metabolites that this plant makes. But yeah, in large part, it will move into big mechanized ag, as we've seen. I mean, it's already happening in the hemp world pretty quickly. So yeah, I think that will be the evolution of the crop.
Yeah, and then hopefully those small boutique grows will really kind of be committed to sustainable type of agricultural processes. So hopefully that will kind of limit this. But this is a good segue. You're talking about these smaller growers and kind of maybe growing up the more lesser known cannabinoids and things. One of the things I wanted to talk with you about was an article that I had read on cannabis science and technology, which was titled "Making Sense of Cannabis Strains Through Chemometrics in Review."
Right.
Something that you had authored with Philippe Henry, who's another friend of Medicinal Genomics. So I wondered if you could, we could talk a bit about that, and maybe a good place to start is to kind of explain kind of what is chemometrics and how can that be kind of applied to helping people make sense of the various numbers of strains out there.
Yeah, so I have to say that one of the reasons I got involved in cannabis testing was to bring transparency to the end user, because it was so obvious to me that the strain naming was just ridiculous, and that even indica and sativa basically had no defensible scientific meaning anymore, and strain names had was nothing more than branding. And so I set out to demonstrate that. This is when I was running DigiPath Labs in Las Vegas, and we had taken in enough samples at the beginning that we had 400 different named strains. And I saw the chemical profile data. So Chemometrics is just looking at the chemical profiles for plants, and that's based on whatever analyte groups you're looking at. And I had the good fortune of Nevada, including terpenes as well as cannabinoids for chemical profiling. And I certainly believe that the cannabinoid profile combined with the terpene profile makes up the chemometric, the fingerprint of that strain. So we showed that if we just looked at cannabinoid profiles, 97% of all those strains from the Vegas area were identical, meaning they were all drug type 1. They were all high THC because, for whatever misinformed reason, consumers of cannabis value cannabis products based on how high the THC content is. And very few growers at that time in Vegas and even today were growing CBD dominant strains. So they were all high THC. And then we did the same analysis on the terpene profile across 19 terpenes and showed that they clustered into 3 different groups. And then working with Medicinal Genomics, we genotyped about 90 of those strains, and Philippe was able to identify 14 SNPs through that data that we could also use to assign a terpene cluster for any given strain that we had selected. So it clearly showed that terpenes were more informative if you wanted to bring some order to all of these strain names. And subsequent groups have done that. Ethan Rousseau and Mark Lewis have done that, and there are other people who have suggested very similar things about the value of clustering based on terpenes. And of course, terpenes are the sensory perception you have when you smell cannabis. I mean, cannabinoids have no odor, so you're perceiving that strain through the combination of volatile organics, which are largely the terpenes that particular strain produces.
Right.
And
yeah.
what's more is we now know that terpenes are physiologically active. So that's why I'm a firm believer that you have to know what the terpenes are, because it's actually the terpenes that impart the subtlety that users perceive between strains.
Right. So I was wondering if you could give maybe a little bit of a primer for maybe the uninitiated. Our podcast, we like to think we have a wide range of folks who are at various levels in their cannabis journey. So I think you did a pretty good job of laying out the difference between cannabinoids and terpenes, but maybe right. a explain like I'm five sort of explanation would be in order here before we get too deep.
Well, so from a chemical structural standpoint, I mean, cannabinoids are terpenes. So terpenes are just a group of chemicals that have isoprene, a 5-carbon structure as their building block, and they can get linked together so they can be monoterpenes, diterpenes, sesquiterpenes, so they can get bigger and bigger. They're both made and collect in the trichomes. So the plant is making the terpenes as either to attract certain pollinators or repel certain insects. So plants don't move around. So they make these volatile organic compounds as a way to communicate with their environment, and the organisms, insects and predators or attractants that are in their environment. So it's actually really interesting, and because you can just smell terpenes, and you can then measure them in your bloodstream. So you're bringing them into your body through receptors in your olfactory, and because they travel throughout your body, we now know that those same receptors exist in other organs of your body, which gives evidence that they actually perform a physiological function. And we know that more than anything from animal studies, and the particular receptors that they bind to are a part of the glutamate, NMDA. They're all sedative by and large in the human body. So they're binding to these neurotransmitter systems. So I like to see it, very simplistically, that the endocannabinoid system is the big overarching regulator of neuroexcitatory pathways in your body, the dopamine response, and then underneath that you have the terpenes that are binding to these other secondary but extremely prevalent neuroexcitatory pathways. So there's some people like the entourage effect term, and some people don't, but clearly these groups of chemicals are working synergistically. And, I think it's well proven that the more you purify any one of the cannabinoids and remove it from these other secondary metabolites that the plant makes, the less of a beneficial effect you have, because you've taken it out of its chemical environment that it more normally operates in.
Well, I think you're right. And after doing CannMed for 5 years now, I think we've seen plenty of evidence to support the idea of the entourage effect. But unfortunately for the consumer, they're not often kind of privy to that information, either because the state doesn't require them to test for terpenes, or it's only a few of the major ones. So I got to imagine that's a huge problem for folks when they're really trying to figure out the product that's going to work for them.
Yeah, no, there's a huge gap. There needs to be an informed educational component, and I tried to do that through the dispensary owners in Vegas, but again, everybody falls back to, well, what's the percent THC?
Right.
That's, for whatever reason, that's just a mindset. And it's like how we got into this crazy mindset that fat is bad and that you should have a low fat diet, or that salt is bad and you shouldn't have salt. And it's just ridiculous, because we need to consume fats, and actually moving toward low fat diets has probably led to some of the mental health issues we have, because it's highly important to take in fats, and certain types of fats, it's important to have salt. Now they've restricted salt so much in some retirement facilities that they're now giving the people who live there salt tablets, because you need salt for your enzymes to function. So, these extreme viewpoints that somehow get out there and are promoted are just erroneous, and it just takes too much time to undo them.
Right. And so is there any way that a consumer, kind of absent having a good laboratory result saying the terpene concentrations, can sort of at least make an educated guess? So can they just follow their nose? Is that a reliable way to do it?
Well, so yeah, actually that's what we've all been left to do, is to figure this out on our own. And particularly if you're not overly curious and researching things online, I mean, at least now there are sources of information online. You can go on to Leafly, and if you have been buying, say, Gorilla Glue, and you like that strain, you can go and look it up, and you can see what are those terpenes, and then you can find other products that have those terpenes. But the first step is to educate people that terpenes are contributing to the physiological outcome of consuming that particular strain or product. And, now we see, and now that a lot of the producers have kind of jumped onto the terpene bandwagon, for good or bad, they're adding terpenes back into products.
Right.
And just like THC, too much of a good thing is not better. And so we had seen extremely high levels of terpenes in certain vape cartridges, and it's not right to just indiscriminately be adding them. And this comes back to another big problem within the industry, is that there's no requirement to list the additives that are going into these extracts. And I think that should definitely be a requirement, particularly if you're in a state where terpene analysis isn't required, then the testing lab would never even see that. And, we kind of got into that issue when some of the black market was adding vitamin E acetate. I mean, a lot of harm can be done because there's a big difference if you're ingesting a terpene or rubbing a terpene on your body versus inhaling it into your lungs. So we desperately need some oversight as to what is going into these high concentration vape cartridges.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because if I understand correctly, the terpene levels are usually quite low, right? Like fractions of a percent. So I would
they're usually in flower, 2 to 4%.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But I can imagine that, if you're adding them to a vape cartridge, they could be much higher than that. And then to your point, sort of what's the effect of that, or
right,
issues that can come with that.
Because these concentrates are so pure and so sticky, and they need to be diluted. And so now all of a sudden it turns out terpenes are a very effective diluent to dilute the product, because like dissolves like, and terpenes are a good dilution component for concentrated cannabinoids. But I think anything above 5% is not a good idea. We had seen terpene concentrations as high as 26, 25%.
Wow.
It's way too high. But we don't know, because, nobody's ever done a study about, is it a good idea to vaporize and inhale terpenes at that level? Yeah, probably not.
Sounds like a good topic for a CannMed presentation.
Yeah.
Well, all right, Cindy, I want to be respectful of your time. I know we're kind of coming up on the end here. So before I let you go, I wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to plug yourself, your social media, website, anything that people need to be aware of in order to follow up with you.
Yeah, so I am the Chief Science Officer at CLIP Labs. We're a new lab in San Diego, and CLIP stands for Cannabis Laboratory Innovation Project. So hold my feet to the fire. I hope to introduce some innovations, and we hope to be expanding across the U.S. We have a fantastic group of scientists here. And our goal is to continue to bring transparency to the cannabis consumer and enlighten them of issues that they should know about.
That's excellent. That sounds like a great project, I should say.
Yeah. Great.
All right, Cindy. Well, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you out there in Pasadena this September.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Have a good day.
You too. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Cindy Orser. Check out the links in the show description to learn more about the topics we discussed, and please also check out the CLIP Labs website. Our next episode will drop August 19th. In the meantime, please go to canmedevents.com/coffee talk and sign up for email updates. That will enter you into a drawing to win 2 tickets to our CannMed 2021 VIP dinner and keep you up to date with all things CannMed 2021. If social media is your thing, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Just search for CannMed Events. And lastly, if you are listening via a podcast app, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so that new episodes download automatically to your device. And if you'd like to leave us a 5-star review, we'd appreciate that as well. All right, that's it from us. Stay safe, stay healthy, and be sure to come back next time for CannMed Coffee Talk.